We keep hearing all students need early education and schools that engage their parents, but reaching that goal is more difficult for many immigrant families. And those families account for a larger percentage of the students in urban school systems such as Boston. A national report on the barriers to learning was recently issued by the Migration Policy Institute's National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy. To tell us how the findings apply locally is our guest from the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, the director of the New Americans Integration Institute, Jeffrey Gross. Thank you very much for being with us, Jeffrey.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me.
I think we might have covered some of this ground here before about Boston, but for people who maybe need a reminder, I mean, how big is this population that we're talking about?
Well, I mean, statewide, we have almost 1 million immigrants. That's 1 out of every 6 people in the Commonwealth. And if we're talking about children, 1 out of, so about 28% of children under 8 are living in immigrant families. That's have at least one immigrant parent. So, and about 8, that's not, of course, all those children are immigrants. In fact, about 85% of them are in fact US born. But they're living in immigrant families, they're often growing up as dual language learners, and they face some of the same challenges all immigrant children face.
So in an urban system like Boston, well, the percentage could be well above 20%.
Oh, in an urban system, you know, we're talking, you know, close to 40–50%.
Right.
And certainly a higher proportion of them are English language learners too.
Let's start with early education, and because we're now hearing, you know, if your child isn't starting at age 3 or so, they're going to be behind when they're in grade 3, and then from there it goes downhill. So, what about early education for immigrant families?
Well, I mean, I think that for immigrant families, in many ways, the story is the same as for any family. The earlier you start, the better your emotional development, your cognitive development, the better the long-term outcomes are. But for immigrant families, it's a particular challenge, of course, for immigrant kids, of course, or kids in immigrant families. Many of them are dual language learners, so they have to cope with systems where they're coming in and encountering languages that are different from their home languages. So you need effective center-based programs that are knowledgeable and supported in trying to, you know, help these kids manage this environment. At the same time, as we were saying earlier, immigrant parents, especially those who are limited English proficient themselves, especially poor parents who are working multiple jobs, who have a hard time getting to the kids' school, you know, face their own burdens. And one of the things that the research has shown, and in particular this, is not just how important early education is to the long-term cognitive, emotional development and educational outcomes of the kid, but how important having parents part of the process is.
Because what I can also easily imagine is that you have the parents working the jobs who probably know some English, but they're not home, and if the child's not in early education, maybe they're being taken care of by a grandparent who perhaps knows 0 English.
Right. I mean, you know, of course, there you have, you know, of course, the parents are entirely engaged, and one of the goals of the work we're doing, and that's happening in the state and nationally, is to, you know, do a better job of connecting all kids, but particularly immigrant kids who perhaps need some of these services more, with, you know, really good center-based care. It is an issue of cost. It's an issue of access, certainly for working parents. But one of the challenges is that the parents are not even aware of or able to connect with the services and the resources that are out there, whether Head Start or child care credits. And the schools themselves also are often working with reduced funding, reduced capacity, and perhaps their own unawareness of some of the challenges their parents are facing. They have a hard time connecting in the other direction.
Well, early education is a place where immigrant kids would start to learn English, among other things, but you still have to speak the language of the families, and you have to ease kids into this new mainstream. So talk about what you need among the people who are teaching in early education.
Well, you know, MIRA has partnering with the Early Education Year Office in the state with some money from the Race to the Top Fund. We've been doing trainings around the state for the last 2 years. We have another year to run, really talking directly to educational providers, to system stakeholders, to Head Start services, to a wide range of agencies about what immigrant and the children in immigrant families need in this setting. I mean, among other things, they need you know, awareness and good supports for their home language. dual language learners come into a system where, you know, that they learn English, they've learned to function in English, although often they're, you know, working and playing with kids who speak many other different languages. But when they go home, they speak their home language, and a recognition of the importance of home language and even literacy in your home language in providing supports, even in English, going into later grades is really an important factor that we hope, well, throughout the educational system, but certainly people in the early education and care system become aware of, because that really does support the longer-term English language learning, both spoken and written, for these kids.
What about engagement? I mean, that's a tough one for any parent, really. But for immigrant families, what are we talking about in particular? The difficulties of engagement.
Well, I mean, we'll start with the sort of, we say to start with statistics, but the fact is that about 45% of the parents in these immigrant families, where, you know, that 28% of children under 8 are low income, about 47% of them are limited English proficient, and that could mean that just means they speak English less than very well. So it could be pretty well, or it could be not at all. So there are some of the barriers right there. Poor parents don't have as much time, they don't have as high a level of education, so they're not necessarily equipped to, in terms of time or in terms of their awareness of the system, to engage with the schools that, if they're lucky, their children can access. Of course, language limitations is also a problem, but the limitations are not just on the parent side. If you flip the coin, you can see that the system itself is not necessarily working very well to sort of give these parents an on-ramp. People don't, you know, people often talk about, when you hear a statistic like 47% of these parents are limited English proficient, you might say, well, why don't they learn English? But the fact is, there are only enough publicly supported English language programs for about 4 to 5% of the people who need it. So there's this huge deficit in available English language teaching resources. And even those programs tend to be focused more on high school completion, on transition to employment or college, understandably, but that also leaves behind many of these lower educated, low income parents who really, you know, who need targeted services to help them not just work with their kids, but access all other parts of the system as their children transition into the higher grades.
No, there once was a time in Boston, if you talked about immigrant languages, you say, well, that's Spanish and Chinese, but today there's so many, and some of them are not spoken by all that many people, but they still need help. What
yeah, in Boston, the figure usually is there are about 140 languages spoken in the Boston public schools. And I mean, you know, Boston used to have a very pretty effective, like the rest of Massachusetts, bilingual education program that was abolished about 10 years ago. The system we have in place, at least from K through 12 on, which is a structured English immersion, that doesn't rely on having, you know, a large number of bilingual teachers. It has many issues of its own. In the early education and care setting, of course, you're not necessarily going to be able to provide, you know, direct language supports for all kids. But that's actually really one of the reasons for bringing the parents, finding ways, whether through interpreters or simply through translating and making available in a reasonable range of home languages, assignments, instructions from the school. That's a way to bring parents and help them be the resource that can help the schools help their students.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you. It's great to hear.
From the MIRA Coalition, Jeffrey Gross. Up ahead, the report from South Boston with Maureen Dayhill.